All right, let's go ahead and get started. And when Jonathan is able to join, he'll just jump in the conversation. We'll do it that way. Does that work for everybody? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm glad everybody can hear me and I can hear everybody as we continue this conversation around critical race theory from the opening plenary. I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague Jordan, who stepped in for me at the very, very last minute, like the last 2 minutes when I couldn't hear anything. So she's off. I guess she said she's off video for now for the rest of the afternoon. But Jordan, I'm giving you a huge shout out. Thank you. So, guys, let me tell you how we were thinking about this. I should say, guys and gals or friends or whatever. Let me tell you how I was thinking about this, how we've been thinking about this at Ed Trust. And why we decided we need a plenary session and then go into a breakout session. Hopefully this afternoon, we set the stage for this fight that we're in around so-called critical race theory and what this means for education in the classroom and beyond. And so what we want to spend this afternoon doing in this session is spending some time talking with each other, sharing information, sharing resources, and really starting to build the network that was talked about earlier that we need in order to push back and keep pushing forward. So that is how I hope to facilitate this conversation. And I really do hope and would like it to be a conversation. I have great panelists with me this afternoon. We have folks from New Hampshire, Tennessee, Kentucky, and eventually Texas. And we asked these advocates to come talk to us because in their states, you know, the anti-C.R.T laws that we were discussing earlier, they're all in different stages. And we thought that that would be really helpful for folks to hear what is going on in certain states, where it's moving, what were some of the roadblocks, what are some of their wins, and then what are folks seeing later on, particularly as others across the country are thinking through their strategy in terms of pushing back and pushing forward in our fight for equity. So with that, I would like, I don't read bios. Y'all can see that on the agenda. So I'm just going to ask everyone to give your name, your organization, and then just give us a sense of what has happened in your state when it comes to some of this anti-C.R.T legislation. I'm going to ask Martha to go first, then Reggie, if you'll jump in, Shaka, and then we'll have Jonathan jump in if he's able to. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Martha.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I appreciate that. My name is Martha Madsen, and I am the Executive Director of New Hampshire Civics. We're a nonprofit organization. We teach teachers K through 12. We also have student programs and public events. And we're nonpartisan, but we did take a stand on this issue. We don't usually do that. We felt that you can't really teach civics if you can't go near current events or you can't be open and you can't sort of tiptoe around certain issues. You may disagree on them, but you need to bring them up. So anyway, we did, I don't know exactly where you want me to start, but we did write a letter as a board, and it was unanimous. We all signed it, opposing the original language of the bill, which was the divisive concepts language that was sort of boilerplate from throughout the country. And there was so much outcry against it that it was tabled. And we thought we had won that. But what happened was it was sent around to different people. It was revised and it now has a different name. It's not called divisive concepts. It's called freedom from discrimination. And it goes on in workplace and education or something like that. But they're now calling it freedom from discrimination. And it was changed so that it actually is harder to challenge legally. So anyway, what we've been doing is just sort of trying to create a cohesive narrative and some clear advice for educators about this. And the law is very unclear. And so it's quite impossible to do that. But
Wait, Martha, you muted yourself. You're on mute. Well, while you do that, I'm going to actually, because I do want to get, we can talk about what you're doing now and some of the resources that you're sharing with educators. Reggie, I'm going to pass it over to you. What's happening in Tennessee? Because y'all have been all over the news recently.
Thanks, Lynn. Hi, everyone. My name is Reggie White. I'm External Relations Manager for the Education Trust in Tennessee. We are the state office for Education Trust. So here in Tennessee, this bill's actually snuck into the final days of our last legislative session. So literally on a Monday, Representative John Reagan, who was on our House Education Administration Committee, tacked on an amendment to already discussed legislation that had passed through the committee. And that was an unrelated kind of education cleanup bill that had worked on like some out-of-date statutes and codes. And it added on this harmful language that, similar to Martha, was the boilerplate language that had been seen across the country. So without any advance notice, the Republican supermajority muscled it through that committee on a 12-3 party line vote, which then advanced it to the floor the very next day. So kind of after catching wind of the legislation and how rapidly it was advancing, we had to hurry up and get into response mode. So the Education Trust in Tennessee convenes our statewide coalition, the Tennessee Alliance for Equity in Education. And we immediately started hopping on the phone, on the email lines, and reaching out to advocates to say, hey, they snuck this in. There's only a couple days left in session. We have to act on this. So we quickly composed a sign-on letter expressing our disappointment and opposition to that amendment that was added to the language and sent it to leadership on both sides of the aisle in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, they ignored our concerns and brought it to the floor. After about 2.5 hours of spirited debate, it was passed again based on the Republican supermajority. So we were able to have some important questions brought up on the floor. We were able to also have some kind of try to use some maneuvers to kind of get it stalled at least, but time unfortunately was just not on our side. So was able to pass through within 2 days in the legislature. And we were just, like I said, in defense mode. So one of our closest partners, the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance, which brings together teachers from across the state, they then hopped into action mode and were able to solicit about 500 signatures of educators and education leaders from across the state. And they addressed a letter to Governor Lee asking him to veto the legislation. It outlined all their concerns about how, this robs students of critical thinking skills, the ability to discuss important historical events, that essentially sterilizes history to not speak to the complex truths of, the American story. Again, unfortunately, Governor Lee ignored the concerns of so much stakeholder outreach, and within 2 weeks, the law was passed, which it was then converted to Public Chapter 493 and signed into Tennessee law. So, we understood that it was so important to keep that conversation going, the harm that it would do for students, the harm that it would do for teachers. We were here from educators, from parents, from students in our Empower Ed network. They truly didn't want this. So we hosted a panel called the Critical Conversations Panel, and we brought together legal experts, scholars in education and in history, as well as students and public school teachers from Tennessee, along with Ed Trust own Dr. Tangi Reed Marshall, to kind of talk about what critical race theory is and how this is truly an attack on equity. Unfortunately, again, about 3 weeks later, our State Department of Education released a draft rule, which will be promulgated to implement this law. And it further outlined kind of what the penalties would be if there was a violation of the statute. So it outlined how teachers could end up with their licenses revoked, and that districts and schools could be penalized up to $5 million per offense if they were found to be in violation of that law. So EdTrust and a number of our partners from the state and across the region did submit public comment during that 10-day window to the State Department of Education. And right now we're waiting on that final language to be dropped. But unfortunately, the Department of Education is not committed to a date. So we're waiting to see what that final language would say and what implementation will truly look like in Tennessee.
Thank you, Reggie. I hear a theme, unfortunately. Shaka, let me pass it over to you. I don't know if Jonathan, can you hear us? Are you good? Okay, you're good. Okay, Shaka, we'll go to you and then Jonathan. Jonathan, I'll tell you when we get to you. Shaka, go ahead.
Good morning and good afternoon, friends, depending upon where you are. My name is Shaka Cummings. I work at the Pritchard Committee in Lexington, Kentucky. We are a nonprofit education advocacy organization. We've been around for about 40 years, and we try to engage citizens in advocating on behalf of the best possible educational outcomes for students across the Commonwealth. We are lucky to be partners with organizations like EdTrust, especially when situations like this arise. So first, the political landscape in Kentucky. We, in our state legislature, there's a supermajority Republican in the House and in the Senate. Now, one of the unique features of the current state of affairs in Kentucky is that we have a Democratic governor. In June, we had legislation that was introduced for the coming legislative session. So our previous legislative session wrapped in April of 2021. We had two pre-filed bill requests that came out early June. The first pre-filed bill request is Bill Request 60, which is the boilerplate. They call it anti-C.R.T. We know that it's anti-diversity and equity legislation that was rolled out, specifically looking at concepts around race, gender, and religion being taught in K-12 classrooms. About a week later, BR 69, Bill Request 69, was pushed through, which is similar in terms of the structure, but inclusive of post-secondary public institutions in the state of Kentucky in terms of the teaching of what is referenced as divisive concepts around race, gender, and religion. So with those pre-filed bill requests on the books and the structure, the current structure that is the state government in Kentucky, we reached out to partners in order to learn a little bit about the state of affairs in different states. The legislation that's been introduced in Kentucky for the coming legislative session, the Bill Request 60, the state legislator who actually introduced that particular bill said, we looked at the legislation that was passed in Tennessee, and we basically have taken that and we've copied that legislation to try to introduce in Kentucky. There are some key differences, however, in the legislation in Kentucky because of the legislative situation I've outlined. So the political situation where we have our Democratic governor who's appointed many folks to different government positions, one of the key differences in the legislation is that the enforcement of the legislation in the state of Kentucky actually runs through the Attorney General's office, because the Attorney General is a Republican who was appointed to his post, versus the situation that is in Tennessee, where it runs through the Department of Education. Essentially, in the state of Kentucky, there wasn't a lot of trust that the Department of Education would really enforce this type of legislation the way that the GOP may want them to, and so they've given that enforcement arm to the Attorney General. The idea of finding teachers, finding school districts, potential removal of licensure, all of those pieces are still the same, with that enforcement coming with the Attorney General, which is problematic in many ways, because I don't know how you get the Attorney General to kind of enforce this. This is not an arm that currently exists in our Attorney General's office in the state of Kentucky. So you would essentially be adding this responsibility and then saying, hey, create a structure for enforcing this type of legislation. Our legislative session begins on January 4th of 2022. So what that meant in the state of Kentucky was that we had several months to be able to research, partner, and coordinate our response, knowing that these pre-filed bill requests are going to be argued on the legislative floor in the coming legislative session. So we've been trying to take advantage of partnerships across the country in formalizing our response. And that's the state of affairs as it is. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that we're actually doing through the Pritchard Committee.
Hey, Jonathan. We're just giving an overview of what's happening in your state on this issue.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, cut me off if I go too long on the overview. We've been at this here in Texas for about 7 months, and it's been a grind. I would say that, that is really a credit to the rapid response and really a massive mobilization across a lot of different advocates from every corner of the state. For those who don't know Texas, and you probably do know this if you watch the news, we are a Republican trifecta state, right? So there's total control at the governor, lieutenant governor, Senate, and House. So I think with that context, I want y'all to think about where we stand and what we've been able to do to push back on this law. I think the other thing folks should know is that we have a biannual legislative session. So Texas is only supposed to meet for about 6 months every 2 years. We've been that session runs from January to June. We're still going in multiple special sessions, and this legislation kind of spanned multiple regular and special sessions. But where we are is the governor has signed Senate Bill 3 into law. It's superseding a previous version of the bill, House Bill 3979, that was passed, but that the governor put back on a special on the agenda for a special because, in his words, it didn't go far enough to ban critical race theory. And I guess what I would say is, there was a lot of this, as I'm sure is true in other states. These kinds of fights were already emerging in local school districts prior to the session. It was very much fueled by the political and cultural context that I think continues, and that honestly would continue with or without state legislation. So the way that I describe the bill, and I can go into more detail, and I really encourage everyone to read the specific bill text that they're confronting. So in that spirit, in the chat, for those who want, I'm putting the actual version of SB 3 that has been passed and signed and that goes into effect on December 2nd here in Texas. But the way that I would describe this is a carefully written bill that serves partisan virtue signaling that's in our state devoid of really any clear or enforceable impact by the state apparatus. So what it's really relying on is the cultural and political environment that's operating outside the bill to do most of the work, right? The misinformation, the media amplification, the political mobilization that's happening at the district level is really what contributes to the chilling effect and the actual enforcement as it may or may not be felt by teachers and district leaders. So I'm not saying that this doesn't do real damage in terms of the state law. It does, really insofar as it gives credibility, cover, and fuel to what's happening before and will probably only likely be more of at the local level. So happy to talk more about what our advocacy looked like, because I think that has a lot to do with the gradual and persistent kind of gutting and mitigation that is in the bill itself. But I also want to be realistic about, even when you win the state policy fight, if you're able to win it as much as you can, that this is very much, at least in Texas, a local mobilization effort. This is all about school board elections. This is all about local policy. And it is really, in a lot of ways, going back to the plenary, what I heard is, are people going to stand up use their voices in a way that is needed, because that's that loud but vocal minority. In some places, in some places, I'd say it is a majority. In others, it is a small minority, but can still pose a real threat. And it's really dependent on where you are.
I actually want to pick up on some of that, Jonathan, and I think I heard it from other folks too. Okay, so let's just take it as kind of a given that there is a massive machine mostly from the right, that's pushing all of this, and they're doing it, and they're going from the top all the way down to the bottom. So that's definitely happening. And they've used this as a lever to push back on. We heard it in the plenary quite a bit, to make it difficult, if not at all, just to, I guess we heard, protect white fragility, protect some of the white supremacy, protect a whole lot of privilege, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we're going to take that as a given too, in terms of that's what it does. I would like us to talk, like, can you all give us a sense of, but on the local level, on the ground level, what actually is the target of this? Like, what is what happens, when these laws, whether they're enforced well or not, or can be enforced or not, et cetera, like, what are y'all going after? What are they trying to get?
Well, I don't know if you want me to start, and I'll go ahead, because Jordan put a few news links in the chat that I think directly address this. I mean, look, I think it runs the gamut. I really do. Some of the impact that I think we're seeing is things like youth and government classes, which are a part of the Texas legislation, I should say. It is also in our state about limiting civic engagement for students and their ability to earn credit for that. And I think for those who've been following the other issue, big issue of voter rights, can probably find some connections to that. So we've seen some of those classes kind of get canceled in some cases prematurely. I think we're seeing the pulling of books. We're seeing the pulling of authors. One example in a Houston suburb is, this is a Caldecott Teen Book Award winner, a Coretta Scott King Book Award winner, who, because there were some teachers who mobilized some complaints, his speaking engagement was canceled. Books were pulled from the library. I think we're seeing that in a lot of different places. So in terms of like exposure to that diverse and reflective literature, I think we're seeing that. We saw a school board member ask for an ethnic studies course that was just approved last summer to be removed. Thankfully, that board pulled that back down. And I will say that most of the time what you see is school board members who are up for re-election, or candidates in these local communities who lost by, say, 400 or 500 low turnout elections, and they're positioning themselves to make this an issue in a school board race, and they're driving a lot of these complaints in their local communities. One of the more egregious examples, and I think we're all looking for more transparency about this specific case, the first Black principal in a suburban district did not have his contract renewed after some pretty public attacks that he was, quote unquote, promoting the conspiracy of systemic racism. We haven't gotten a really clear explanation from that school board as to why the contract was not renewed. So those are the kinds of local examples that I think, whether or not these things actually reference the legislation or not, are the kinds of things that we are seeing. And so we want to continue to monitor, especially with the bill that isn't technically in effect yet, if and how that bill continues to be used in these local scenarios.
I was just kidding. Martha, I think you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I just want to say that our bill is already in effect, and I have not heard any public story. I mean, it may be happening and I just don't know about it. I have not heard of anybody complaining or, anything like that. I do know that there has been chilling. There's been change in curriculum. I've heard of that through teachers. And I do think that that in New Hampshire, at least, the intention is not so much to prevent. It's okay to talk about, way long ago in history, there was something called racism or sexism. It's more preventing teachers, or really making teachers think about hard and consider not teaching about systemic racism in the present, and unconscious implicit bias. Those are two things that seem to be very specifically identified in the law, and the repercussions, the punishments are similar and also a little different from what was said before for teachers. The AG or any aggrieved party can basically lodge a complaint to the Department of Justice or the Commission on Human Rights in New Hampshire. And at that, if those bodies, if those organizations find that there's cause, that this, then it goes to the Department of Education, and they would then consider taking away or suspending for a certain amount of time a teaching license. So that was just kind of finishing up on the first question that I didn't get to answer.
All right. Anything anybody want to add? I mean, definitely hear the teaching profession, teachers, what's happening in the classroom. Anything else?
Yeah, I would definitely say that, kind of even more on a macro level, they're definitely speaking to like the far right conservative base. I think our Department of Education has even gone on record to say that there were no instances of critical race theory actually being taught in Tennessee. But at the same time, our governor has gone on the record in saying, Tennessee teachers won't teach anything but unapologetic American exceptionalism. So we all know the danger of a single story, right? Like when I think about kind of what's at stake there, I think about my grandparents. Like my grandmother was raised in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. My grandfather in a family of sharecroppers in southern Louisiana. And I think about the stories they tell me about their educational experiences growing up under Jim Crow in the American South, and how those realities really inform where we are today. So to strip teachers of the ability to speak to that nuance, to speak to those personal experiences, and as our Empower Ed student Salwa spoke to earlier, to really speak to the lived experiences and cultural identities of so many students, is really a big disservice. So we know that as Martha and Jonathan both shared, there's kind of this push to silence those conversations, to strip any kind of critical thinking about these issues, and to really stop our future leaders from grappling with important social concerns.
I'm curious with this, we know the folks who were definitely on our side on this, and we know the folks on the other side. What about, and I think Martha, you mentioned it, we heard it earlier, this movable middle, or the folks who seem to be quiet and are not saying much? I'm just curious, what are some of the roadblocks, I guess I'm wondering, with getting them to come in? And if you've dealt with any of those roadblocks, how have you dealt with them? How have you addressed them?
Yeah, a lot of people just don't know about it because it was stuck into the budget and it was signed as part of the budget. So it was not brought up in a public way. So that has been hard because, because there wasn't, there was a discussion about it, but then it was shifted and just kind of stuck in there. It was a sleight of hand in a way, so that a lot of people don't know about it. The other thing we face in New Hampshire, and I don't know if others face it, I know Texas has a really different way of managing education, but we're very locally controlled here. And so we don't have a lot of statewide coalitions. We're working on that, and I think we're getting better at that, but we're quite siloed, so that each superintendent, each district with its own attorney is sort of providing that guidance or not, right, for teachers. Some teachers are being told, just do exactly what you've always done. We have your back and you got to keep doing it. Others are being told, well, don't teach that this year because we're just not sure where this is going. So I think, you know, that's another roadblock, is that we're pretty siloed, and I don't think we have a common message as an education community here. We're pretty splintered.
Shaka, I know y'all are being like trying to be proactive about this, and I'm curious, how are you anticipating some of these challenges you might have? How are you moving forward with that?
No, absolutely. We are lucky with the Pritchard Committee, again, to be able to partner with great national organizations like EdTrust. We've reached out to Reggie quite a bit in trying to craft our strategy in terms of response. We in the state of Kentucky, through the Pritchard Committee, have our equity coalition of it's around 140 members across the Commonwealth. And so part of the strategy is mobilizing that equity coalition. And as we work to mobilize that equity coalition, we've been working together to craft an equity toolkit that we could give to our membership so that they can actually lead conversations around Bill Request 60, Bill Request 69, and around equity and education. The middle is who we are targeting in terms of our strategy. There's just an understanding that the folks who are far right, we're not shifting them. So we're not going to put our energies there. And we have folks who are on our side. So we just want to make sure that we're giving them the tools to be able to mobilize those folks who are in the middle. And what we've heard is that there are, even in a state like Kentucky, where the legislature is supermajority GOP, there are those that are questioning this strategy within the GOP. So now, how do we give those folks the strategies to be able to push back within their own caucus? So we're focused in that area. We're focused on that center. And really what we're focusing around, Lynn, we're focusing around defining equity, talking about where equity shows up in public education, and making sure that folks understand that these attacks on equity may actually go against your best interest, even though you think they align with your political interest. Because in public education, free and reduced lunch is an equity program. Most funding models within states, that has an equity lens to it. When we start talking about special education, that is an equity program. And so if you start pushing back against equity in public education, then just understand that these are also the types of programs that you're pushing back against. The other component that we want to make sure that folks understand as well is that as we begin to kind of craft that definition of equity, we want schools who are on our side to make sure that they are proliferating that message in their local communities, because we know that there are superintendents and teachers and different organizations around the state that they believe that this legislation is bunk. Okay, we need you to be loud in your local communities. In Kentucky, we have a local control model around education. And so we want folks to understand you have the local control to be able to push back against legislation like this. And also to understand that when bills like this are passed centrally in Frankfort, the capital in Kentucky, they're actually pushing against your local control as well, in that tradition that we've always had. So just understand all of the ramifications of this type of legislation, because again, you might think it aligns with your political interest, but it may actually go against your personal interest.
All right, so we have a strategy there. Other breakthrough strategies, tactics, things that have worked, things that we want to make sure we're sharing with each other.
I mean, I'll share, again, in our context, I want to echo what Shaka said, which is if you can find especially a Republican leader who has concerns. I mean, listen, on the floor, we heard repeatedly Democratic leaders saying that in their private conversations with their Republican colleagues, there was a lot of concern. They were not going to publicly oppose this legislation because it was really being pushed from the top down. However, as we changed the narrative, as we persisted in our advocacy, we did get a Republican leader who is on the Education Committee to publicly express concern about the legislation, and then to step into the role of being the bill sponsor, which I'm sure he did not want to do, to negotiate and mitigate the impact which is what led to a lot of the more substantive amendments that we were able to win on the bill. So I think that if you can do that, I get needing to mobilize and strategize with your friendly offices. And if those are Democrats, then obviously we did that too, to some success. But I think that looking for those allies where you can be strategic and find them is necessary. Just to give you an example, though, of what is in that bill, and I would love folks to actually look at SB 3 in Texas. Here's what we won. We won protections of student speech against potential chilling effects. We won protection of educators against private legal actions. We won protections of curriculum against interpretation that would prohibit the teaching of state standards, which includes ethnic studies still. We won protections of classroom activities that do involve students communicating with elected officials on that civic engagement piece. And we won removal of one of these restricted concepts that was copycatted, that I always felt was one of the most tenuous and vague, which was that an individual should not feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of the individual's race or sex. These are not, like, to me, small wins in terms of the way we were able to push back against the language that's in the bill. So I think that, that is about the coalition building, the aligned messaging, creating those on-ramps for folks to testify, to contact their legislative offices, and as much as possible to publicly oppose the bill. And we had nearly 100 organizations that I think ran the gamut, from students to teachers to school board leaders to school district leaders, even to business leaders who were willing to publicly oppose the bill. And so I just think, again, we would have loved to kill the bill. That was success. We're not out there claiming that we won, but these are our friends, right, who are, I think, strategizing. And so I just want to say that I do think there are lessons we should be learning about at least how to mitigate the impact of these bills on paper. That doesn't solve the problem of what's happening locally, which, again, I think is going to happen with or without the bills.
I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to, Martha, Reggie, lessons learned, things you can share, because I want to make sure we open it up for.
Well, I want to congratulate everyone else on this panel for all their great work. I think we have, in New Hampshire, we have a ways to go. One thing, in terms of on the teacher level, because that's my focus, is I shared with the group already a statement that a teacher who's also a lawyer wrote as kind of a disclaimer to put on all of his curriculum. He's not changing a thing, but he's just acknowledging that this is happening and that what his intentions are, and if they have any issues, that they should please address them to him. So again, that's not legally binding, but it is an intervention, that makes him feel more comfortable with just continuing to do what he's always done. I think doubling down on relationships is, especially high school teachers don't always tend to those relationships with parents because they're focusing on the more independent student. I think that goes a long way, although there's some people who are going to just be really challenging no matter what you do. We've had some people writing op-eds. In fact, we have, a Republican on our board, and also the former Democratic governor candidate write something together in opposition to this. And again, it was tabled, but then it was snuck in. What else? Lessons learned. I think lessons learned are we really need to form a more a tighter coalition. There are coalitions ongoing. There's a race and equity coalition through the Endowment for Health in New Hampshire that I've been involved with and is ongoing. And there is one on education, but it's just like tapping into those resources and really focusing that group. We also have a civic education coalition just forming, brand new. So hopefully within a couple of years, we'll be able to get rid of this and to repeal it, or like Jonathan said, at least to make it more clear and to have less of a chilling effect, and to be, in those amendments, it sounds like you got a lot accomplished, even though you didn't want it to begin with. So anyway, I think those are some of my lessons learned and tactics.
So Reggie, I'm going to ask you about lessons learned. If you any lessons learned, but also, no, I'll leave it there because I have another question for you though. So for everybody, but I'm going to start with you, Reggie. But go ahead. Lesson learned. Anything you want to add?
For sure. One thing I would say that's super important and that I think has been really significant here in Tennessee is making sure that we incorporate student voice. Our students have taken on the responsibility of writing op-eds, to signing on to letters, to really speaking about this issue in the public sphere. And I mean, so often, adults see students as folks who policy is acted upon. But in Tennessee, we really try our best and strive our best to make sure that our student leaders know that they have the power, their voice matters, and really supporting them and being the courageous leaders that we know they can be. I have to give a shameless plug and shout out to Vilmaris Gonzalez, who is in our Tennessee office, who leads our Empower Ed student network. So Sawa, who was in our plenary session, and other students in that network have really done an incredible job about speaking about the harm of legislation like this. And we know that will be super important in the days ahead, not only as we're thinking about implementation on the K-12 level, but potentially anticipating any higher ed attacks that could come at the legislator as well.
Well, you took my question. That's what I was going to ask. Where do students fall in all of this? Okay. All right. It's got my 2 minute warning. So 2 minutes. Will you all just give us wise, smart parting words, leaving this session? I'm just going to go around. I'm going to start with you, Shaka.
I don't know. It's a lot of making sure that you are pulling in the same direction. You want similar messaging. You want to make sure that you have all of your advocates and kind of pulling in the same direction so that the legislators understand that there is a unified constituency that believes that legislation like this is just wrong. And you will be held accountable as a politician, right? Because when you have that unified constituency, they go vote too. So making sure that you can get that unified voice and amplify that unified voice as best you can, I think is incredibly important. And one thing that I'll throw out there, in states where legislation like this is passed, I really would love to get with partners who are versed in law to figure out how we can take those laws and turn the tide. Because when you start using language like things that might cause discomfort, well, guess what? I had to sit in a class and read Huck Finn, and I had to read To Kill a Mockingbird. I felt discomfort. So now how do I take that verbiage and push back and maybe take those laws and turn the tide against folks in a way that they weren't intending? Maybe that's the next session for next year.
We'll put it on the list. April 2022. All right. Jonathan, party where your last.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything that was just said on message discipline. I would also say be mindful of the headlines. The chilling effect is real. It is incumbent on us as advocates to deliver accurate information about these bills. That isn't to deny their impact, but I do think that sometimes we risk amplifying the chilling effect when we give too much oxygen to things that may be intended but are not real in the legislation. So I just want to echo that need. It's tempting because we're all advocates. We want to mobilize our people, but I think there's always a double edge to that. I think the second thing is let's be opportunistic about the moment. I just feel like we can oftentimes get into the defensive crouch, but like I think the plenary said, this is the moment. We've been having quote unquote having this conversation about racial justice and racial equity, and folks have come out and said, yes, that's something that they believe in. Now is not the time to be silent. So I think that, this is the test, and we should be opportunistic about expanding our movement right now, in a proactive way and not just in a reactive way.
Martha?
I would echo the critical importance of coalition building and messaging. We have not been able to do that yet. We're working on that still. I also just want to put out there that, there are teachers every day. They're dealing with this. in the back of their mind while they're dealing with a whole bunch of other things, masking and the vaccine issue and all kinds of things, and students. So just to be aware to support teachers, because they're doing a lot. Most of them are doing their very best. And this is really tough.
Good reminder. Reggie.
Certainly. I would definitely echo a lot of what my colleagues have said about the importance of coalition building. I think making sure that coalition is broad-based. We know that we're having conversations with folks in the civil rights community, the disability rights community, but also like educator prep providers, higher education institutions, practitioners on the ground. I think making sure that you have all those different perspectives in this conversation is super important. I think also to in the situation where you're able to have the time to do so, really think strategically about who are some of your public champions that will be willing to have these conversations. You have to have some that are going to be willing to come out openly and talk about these things on the record, but you also need some folks who are willing to have some of those backroom conversations with folks who might be of a like mind or share the same political ideology. And sometimes those conversations can move things as well.
All right. Well, friends, thank you so much for spending this time with us. We got a lot in the chat, a lot of resources. Always, anybody out there, you can reach out to Ed Trust, and we're always happy to connect people, help be a resource hub, so that we can all work together, march together, move forward together. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye because I think we're going to get kicked off. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the boot camp.